What if the creature locked in the iron box had never been the monster at all? In Billings, Montana, a carnival ground braced itself against the chill. An iron cage sat at its center. Inside, a massive German shepherd waited, his breath fogging the bars. His frame was scarred, his silence heavy. Locals called him the terror from Crazy Peak. They whispered stories, he split steel. He tore through hounds. And then, from the crowd, a Marine stepped forward. His eyes were steady. His hand was open. He hadn't come to tame. He had come to be redeemed. In the minutes ahead, an entire town would face a choice, between fear and compassion, and one man's life would change forever. Before we go further, tell me where you're tuning in from. Type your country down in the comments. And if you believe that no man and no animal should ever be abandoned in a cage, click subscribe. Because this story may just renew your faith in second chances. Billings, Montana. Late autumn. The scent of dust and horses hung in the air, sharp with the cold sliding down from the Beartooth Range. The clouds were streaked gray and sagged low, pressing on the horizon. At the far edge of town, the fairground buzzed and yet felt hollow at the same time, alive with sound, haunted by something unspoken. Wooden stalls framed the dirt path, their vendors peddling caramel corn, ropes, leather belts worn from use. Families walked together in clusters. Mothers tugged their children close. Fathers darted glances, uncertain whether they wanted to see what drew everyone here. At the very end stood a wagon strengthened with raw iron bars, bolted so tightly they looked like they could hold back an ox. But inside wasn't an ox. It was a German shepherd larger than most had ever seen, closer in spirit to a wolf torn from old legend. His coat was sable black streaked with pale scars. His ears stood upright, notched at the tips from forgotten battles. His eyes, ringed with old tissue, shone a deep, reddish brown. Under lantern light they looked almost unholy. His chest rose and fell slowly, his exhale a harsh rattle that clanged against the bars. He was enormous, as tall as a man's hip and wider than any farm dog bred for work. The people of Billings gave him a name that traveled in whispers, the Beast from Crazy Peak. Around the cage, the crowd kept a wary distance. They formed a circle of dread and awe. There was Sheriff Alton Briggs, 50 years old, his thick gray mustache drooping above lips stained from chewing tobacco. His belly stretched the seams of his deputy's shirt. He leaned against a hitch post, squinting, not from the dim lanterns, but from suspicion. Briggs loved order. He also loved the kind of attention a spectacle drew. And tonight, the spectacle was the dog. Old Martha Dwyer stood close, her bent frame trembling with cold. Arthritis had twisted her hands, but she clutched her grandson's wrist so tightly the boy winced. Sharp blue eyes pierced from her thin face. Martha had lived through too many winters alone, and believed every rumor she heard, then spread them louder than most. Then there was Jed Carmichael, a rancher whose sunburnt skin and crooked nose made him stand out even more. He laughed too hard, as if his chuckles could disguise the unease darting in his eyes. Elbowing his friend, he swore he knew a man who had seen the beast tear through steel chains. The stories burned like wildfire. Some said the shepherd had slaughtered 3 fighting dogs in one night. Others claimed he was found devouring a bear carcass with only his jaws. Nobody, they insisted, had kept him chained for more than a week. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, voices trembling, "Is it really a monster, Ma?" And the mothers pulled them back, muttering quiet prayers. The air hummed with tension, with murmurs, with fear. At any second, it seemed, the beast might hurl himself against the bars and end a life before anyone could cry out. Yet the shepherd didn't move like something born to kill. He sat still, chest heaving, his gaze fixed on something beyond the crowd, as though he had seen enough of humanity to stop caring. Sheriff Briggs flipped a pouch of coins in his hand, his tone half jest, half challenge. "Anyone brave enough to take him home? Or do we send him back up the mountain to rot?" A few men laughed. Others spat into the dirt. Not one stepped forward. Who in their right mind would want such a cursed beast? And then Ethan Granger appeared. He was 38, a former United States Marine. His body was lean, hardened by years of drills and burdens heavier than most dared carry. His skin bore the bronze of deserts and mountain storms. His square jaw carried a faint scar. His hair, dark with strands of gray, was trimmed short in the style he'd never abandoned. Hazel eyes, calm, steady, belonged to a man who had stared into both war and emptiness. In worn jeans, flannel, and boots beaten from ranch work, he walked with precision. Not a wasted step. Still a soldier, even out of uniform. People in Billings knew of him, though not much. They knew he had returned from service some years ago. That he lived alone on barren soil south of town. Some whispered his wife had left him. Others said she died. Either way, he kept to himself, purchasing supplies in silence, never raising his voice. To some, he was pitiful. To others, suspicious. No one expected him to step forward that night. The murmurs hushed into stunned silence as Ethan walked up, boots grinding the dirt. The dog inside the cage rose, towering, his broad shoulders heaving. His lips peeled back to show teeth like broken ivory. A growl rippled through the air, raising hairs on every neck. But Ethan didn't flinch. He reached the wooden counter where the sheriff stacked his wagers. Reaching into his coat, he drew a pouch heavy with coins and set it down. The clink rang deliberate. Briggs blinked, almost laughing. "Granger, you lost your mind. You know what you're asking for." Ethan's voice was steady, low. A voice born of battles. "I'm not here to gamble. I want the dog." A ripple went through the crowd, gasps, laughter, curses. Carmichael spat in disbelief. Martha clutched her grandson closer. Someone muttered, "He won't see the morning." Ethan didn't look at them. His eyes stayed locked on the shepherd, whose growl had faded into a tense silence. The animal's ears twitched. His gaze narrowed, as though he recognized something no one else could see. And Ethan, unshaken before the bars, felt something too. Not danger. Kinship. He knew what it was to be caged, even without chains. The fairground buzzed in disbelief as the sheriff hesitated, hand already moving toward the coins. But Ethan spoke again, not to the crowd, not to the lawman, but to the creature. "I want that dog." The fairground emptied under a hush of disbelief. Lanterns sputtered low as Ethan Granger loaded the iron cage onto the bed of his rusted pickup. Inside, the shepherd remained still, his immense body pressed into the narrow space, breath rasping like wind through hollow pipes. He did not thrash. He did not snarl. He only stared past the noise, as if the jeers and gasps had long ago lost their power. The sun bled out behind the Beartooth ridges, purple and gold smeared across the sky. The Montana air bit with sharpness, enough to sting skin. Dust rose beneath the truck's wheels as Ethan drove away, leaving whispers and wagers to dissolve into the hum of his engine. The road south twisted through barren fields, fences sagging like tired bones. Billings itself had grown neon around the interstate, motels, diners, glowing signs, but outside town the land still carried scars of drought. Grass broke in brittle stalks, the earth cracked and thirsting. Ethan's hand gripped the wheel steady. The other brushed absently against the scar along his jaw, an old habit from nights overseas when silence pressed too hard. He had given 12 years to the Marines. Not ended by fear, but by fire, an explosion in Kandahar that had stolen 3 men and left him alive with memories jagged as shrapnel. Since then, quiet had been his armor. The farm had been his father's before him, passed down with debts and soil gone sour. Ethan kept it alive through grit, not abundance. He had nothing else to cling to. At a crossroads near a weather-worn service station, an old attendant stepped out. Tom Wheeler, in his 70s, wore coveralls stained with oil and a cap tipped crooked. His hands shook faintly with age and years of drink. He narrowed his eyes at the sight of the cage in Ethan's truck. He'd seen strays, even coyotes, but nothing like this. The shepherd's head turned under the fluorescent light, scars glinting pale. Tom instinctively stepped back. "Lord above," he muttered. Ethan lifted 2 fingers off the wheel in silent greeting, but didn't stop for gas or talk. Night had fallen by the time his ranch appeared, a stretch of cracked dirt, a leaning barn that seemed one wind from collapse, and a cabin sagging at the porch. No lanterns burned inside. Solitude was the only company Ethan expected anymore. He parked by the barn, shut the engine, and listened. The shepherd's rasping breath filled the stillness. Coyotes called in the distance, thin against the dark. For a long moment, Ethan stood at the truck bed, staring at the cage. He traced the scars that striped the dog's flanks, the map of old cruelties carved into fur and flesh. Finally, he unlatched the cage door. His movements were slow, deliberate. The shepherd lifted his head, ears twitching, muscles braced tight. For a heartbeat Ethan thought violence would burst loose. But the dog did not charge. His eyes, steady and sharp, searched Ethan's face as if weighing something unseen. Ethan crouched low, his voice firm but quiet. It carried the cadence of a man who had given orders but refused to command this creature. "I'm not here to chain you," he whispered. "I came to live alongside you, if you'll have me." The silence stretched thin. The autumn wind rattled the tin roof of the barn. Then, with a sigh like surrender, the shepherd lowered his head and stepped forward until his muzzle pressed against the bars near Ethan's hand. His breath was hot, heavy with neglect. But his eyes softened, faintly, just enough. Then he let the weight of his head sink into Ethan's palm. The Marine did not flinch. He let it rest there, knowing this was fragile, breakable with the wrong move. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of cedar and dust. Ethan rarely cooked more than beans or eggs. Military-issue cans lined the shelves, relics of supply runs he still kept like habit. He set a metal bowl of water by the hearth, poured kibble he kept for strays, and left the door wide. The shepherd lingered on the porch, gaze sweeping the shadows, before stepping inside. His paws moved cautious, claws clicking like distant rain. Ethan noticed the limp in his hind leg, the way his shoulders hunched as if waiting for a blow. Later, with firelight flickering, Ethan sat in the chair his father had built years before. He watched the dog stretched across the hearth. The scars looked like rivers cut through a dark map, each one holding a story Ethan did not yet know. He thought of the men he had buried, the silence that haunted their absence. And he felt kinship he had not expected. Both had been trapped by violence. Both carried marks others couldn't see past. Maybe together, they might breathe again. At midnight, the wind whistled through shingles. Ethan stirred from half-sleep to hear the shepherd rise, circle the cabin once, then return to the hearth. No growl. No bark. Only the rhythm of calmer breath. Ethan closed his eyes and let a thought slip through that he had long denied: maybe this battered creature wasn't a curse at all. Maybe he had been sent to keep Ethan alive. So the first night passed, not with rattling chains or bared teeth, but with the fragile weight of trust. Fragile as glass, but real enough to begin everything. Morning broke with mist creeping across the fields, softening fences and barns like the land itself wanted to hide its scars. Ethan rose before dawn, as he always had. The smell of wood smoke and bitter coffee filled the cabin. By the hearth, the shepherd lifted his great head. His ears twitched. His eyes followed Ethan with no bark, no growl, only watchfulness. Ethan studied him, then spoke, voice rough with sleep but steady. "You'll need a name if you're going to stay." The dog tilted his head, lips parting to reveal pale ridges of teeth. Ethan sipped his coffee, thinking, then settled on the one word that felt right. Ranger. The dog blinked once, slow. For Ethan, it was answer enough. Days settled into rhythm faster than Ethan expected. Ranger trailed at his heels through barren fields, padding silently, each step measured as though the ground itself might betray him. He ate carefully, each mouthful slow, never greedy. Food, Ethan realized, was something Ranger had learned could vanish without warning. At night the dog curled in the old shed by the barn. At first he ignored the straw Ethan laid for him, choosing instead the hard earth. Slowly, he began resting along the wall, pressed where the drafts were weakest. His silence filled the ranch, not oppressive, but steady, a presence that occupied spaces Ethan hadn't known were hollow. Not everyone welcomed him. On the third morning, Ruth Holloway came. A widow in her late 60s, she carried herself straight as a fence post, her silver hair wound into a stern knot. Once a schoolteacher, she had turned her sharp tongue to keeping watch over community morals. Years ago she had buried a son claimed by drink, and ever since she clung to discipline as if it alone could shield the world. She stood at Ethan's gate, shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes glinted behind her spectacles. "Ethan Granger," she called, voice cutting like chalk on slate. "You'd best think twice about keeping that beast here. People are already talking." Ethan leaned against the fence, arms folded. His voice was polite, even, but unmoved. "He's mine now. I'll see to him." Ruth sniffed hard, muttered something that sounded like prayer, and walked off shaking her head. Children were no gentler. Passing by on their way to school, they huddled in clusters, whispering about the scars across Ranger's muzzle. One boy, Thomas Creel, thin as a sapling, ears too big for his head, summoned enough courage to shout, "Monster," from a safe distance. Ranger didn't lift his head from where he lay by the porch. Ethan, watching from the doorway, felt both relief and unease at the dog's restraint. By the week's end, whispers had reached the church. Pastor Michael Thorne, a broad man with a booming sermon voice and a permanent groove between his brows, spoke to his congregation of beasts in Scripture and God's warnings about guarding innocence. He never said Ethan's name, but everyone knew who he meant. After service, neighbors gave Ethan half-kind, half-wary advice. Walt Kearney, a farmer with hands hardened by years of work, put it softly. "Careful, son. That dog's seen too much darkness. Sometimes creatures don't come back from that." Ethan thanked him without promise. He'd heard the same words spoken of soldiers. Still, Ranger proved himself in small ways. He walked the fence line without straying. He never snapped at cattle. When strangers passed on the road, he stood watchful but silent. He did not lunge. He did not snarl. Slowly, some began to notice. But unease clung like a shadow. Then came the storm. It struck at the end of October. Rain came down in sheets, the yard turning to rivers of mud. Wind shook the shutters loose and forced icy air through every seam of the cabin. Ethan, disciplined as always, felt the fragility of the ranch beneath the storm's weight. Ranger paced the porch once, rain plastering his fur, then curled tight against the door, unwilling to leave. Near midnight, Ethan stirred at a sound too sharp to be thunder, the screech of a window latch forced open. Instinct, carved by years of combat, snapped awake. He rose silently, reaching for the flashlight he kept by his bed. The beam cut across the dark. A figure hunched at the back window, lean and soaked, one leg already inside. It was Jacob Reynolds, Jake to the folks of Billings. Early 30s, wiry, with a patchy beard failing to hide hollow cheeks. His clothes were rags, boots full of holes. Son of a miner who'd drunk himself into the grave, Jake had drifted since boyhood, stealing food or tools when work ran dry. Tonight hunger had driven him to Ethan's ranch. Before Ethan could move, a blur of muscle thundered past. Ranger launched from the porch into the cabin, landing heavy on the floorboards. His growl rumbled low, teeth flashing in the flashlight's glare. Jake froze, caught mid-climb. Panic flooded his eyes. He stumbled back toward the sill, but Ranger advanced, pushing him into the corner. His bark snapped like gunfire, loud, commanding, enough to paralyze. Ethan's voice cut through, iron steady. "Don't move." The beam caught Jake's gaunt face. Ethan recognized him instantly. His tone carried no pity. "Reynolds. You picked the wrong place." Jake stammered excuses, cold, hunger, no harm meant, but Ethan ignored the words. His attention stayed on Ranger. The shepherd stood taut, hackles raised, every muscle wired. But he had not struck. He had pinned Jake, holding him until Ethan arrived. There was control in his stance, discipline buried under scars. Ethan lowered the light slowly. A realization coiled through him. This dog had been trained once, not by kindness, but by someone who demanded restraint for sport, for cruelty. His scars told the truth. Ranger was no wild beast. He was a survivor of training few men could endure. The storm howled against the roof. Inside, silence thickened. Ranger's growl faded. Jake, seizing his chance, scrambled through the window and vanished into the rain. Ethan didn't chase him. He laid a steady hand on Ranger's wet fur instead. The shepherd looked up, amber eyes searching. In them, Ethan saw more than an animal. He saw a creature that had lived through pain yet chosen not to unleash it. A protector, not a monster. That night, as thunder rolled and rain hammered the earth, Ethan lay awake, mind replaying the moment. Ranger could have killed, but he hadn't. He had chosen restraint. The question was not what he was, but what he could become. By dawn the storm had rolled east, leaving the fields heavy with rain and washed clean. The fences still sagged, the barn still leaned, but for a moment the ranch seemed alive again under a pale October sun. Ranger paced the yard stiffly, his scarred body rigid not with age, but with wounds that had never mended right. In daylight Ethan saw them clearer than ever. Puckered circles where blades or jagged steel had cut deep. Rings around his neck where chains had bitten long. Fur gone thin in patches that would never regrow. Ethan's jaw tightened. No creature should have carried such history. Later, while fixing a latch on the barn door, he called Ranger over. The shepherd obeyed with hesitation, tail low, ears flicked back. Ethan crouched, brushing coarse fur gently, fingers tracing scars. Ranger didn't flinch when Ethan pressed near them. But when his hand rose higher, an unthinking gesture, as though to strike, the dog froze. His amber eyes widened. His body locked rigid. A tremor shuddered through him. Ethan lowered his hand instantly, his stomach twisting. It wasn't pain Ranger feared. It was memory, the whistle of a whip, the lash of cruelty. The dog didn't brace against hurt. He braced against betrayal. Ethan sat back on his heels, rubbing the scar at his jaw, Kandahar flashing in his mind, the faces of men who never came home. His voice was rough when he whispered. "You fought your war too, didn't you?" Ranger said nothing. His silence was enough. It was around that time Miriam appeared. She was 9, all angles and skinny limbs, chestnut hair tied into uneven braids. Freckles scattered across her cheeks, and her big brown eyes carried both boldness and worry. She was the daughter of Samuel and Clara Whitfield, neighbors whose farm sat across the ridge. Samuel, once a blacksmith, now walked with a limp that slowed him but never stopped him. Clara, tall and severe, held their family together with iron will, though her smile came quick when it reached her daughter. The Whitfields were cautious people, known for their devotion to church and their privacy. Miriam was different. Curiosity pulled her farther than her parents allowed. She had heard the stories at school, the whispers of a monster living at Granger's ranch. Children dared each other to creep close. Miriam didn't just want to dare. She wanted to know. So one afternoon she slipped down the ridge barefoot, a hunk of cornbread clutched in her hand. She reached Ethan's gate and froze. Ranger lay under the porch, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed. When Miriam stopped at the fence, his ears twitched. His gaze sharpened, unblinking. Her heart pounded. But she didn't run. She pushed the bread through the slats with trembling fingers. For a long moment, Ranger didn't move. Then, slowly, he rose. His bulk was terrifying up close, muscle, scars, a muzzle that looked carved from war itself. Miriam's knees shook. She thought she might collapse. But the shepherd sat. His eyes softened. His tail shifted once against the dirt. No growl. No teeth. Only waiting. Ethan had been watching from the porch, hammer in hand. He came down quickly. "Miriam," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Does your mother know you're here?" Her cheeks flushed. She pulled back her hand. "No, sir. I just wanted to see him." Ethan glanced at Ranger, who stayed calm, then sighed. "He's not a toy, you understand. He's been through more than most men could bear." Miriam nodded solemnly. She tucked the bread into the grass. Ranger stepped forward, sniffed once, then took it gently, chewing as though careful not to scare her. Ethan watched with something close to disbelief. For days Ranger had trusted only him. Yet here he sat quiet before a child, scarred beast and innocent spirit finding peace where no one expected it. By evening Clara came searching. Her figure stood stiff at the gate, her gray dress neat, hair pinned tight. Her eyes cut sharp as knives. "Miriam," she called, her voice sharp as whipcord. The girl hurried back, head bowed, but not before sneaking one last look at Ranger. Clara gave Ethan a nod, polite, tight-lipped. "I'd appreciate it if you kept her away from that." Ethan nodded in return. He understood a mother's fear. Still, the image of Ranger sitting steady for Miriam lingered in his mind. Whispers followed soon after. In town one afternoon, Ethan stopped at the hardware store for feed and a lantern wick. Outside, two men spoke low but clear enough for him to hear. Hank Doyle, broad-shouldered with a crooked hat, was known for shady livestock trades. Beside him was Luke Barrett, wiry, pockmarked, often seen near saloons. "They say one of Vance's dogs is still out there," Doyle muttered. "The big one. Called Iron Jaw." Barrett spat into the dirt. "If that's true, he's worth a fortune. Herd buyers back east will pay double for a beast like that. You bring in that monster, you're set for life." Ethan froze where he stood. His blood ran cold despite the sun. He set his supplies down quickly, paid, and left without a word. But his thoughts raced. Ranger was no stray. He was tied to men like Vance, dog traffickers, gamblers, cruel hands that broke animals for profit. If they learned Ranger lived in Billings, they would come. That night Ethan stood at his cabin window, watching Ranger stretch across the yard. The dog lifted his head once as though sensing worry, then settled back down. Ethan's fists clenched. "They'll come for you," he whispered, more to himself than to the dog. "But they'll have to come through me first." The morning air bit with frost, the kind of cold that made the sky feel endless and every blade of grass cling to white. Ethan had just finished mending a stretch of fence when Ranger froze mid-step. The shepherd's scarred body stiffened, nostrils flaring, ears pricked toward the eastern ridge. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Ethan straightened, squinting into the distance. Then it came, the sharp crack of gunfire rolling across the hills like thunder. Without hesitation, Ethan grabbed the weathered satchel he kept by the porch, stuffed with bandages and salve. He swung his jacket over one arm and broke into a run. Ranger bounded beside him, his stride long despite the limp in his hind leg, a shadow of muscle and scar cutting through the morning frost. The ridge climb was steep, shale sliding beneath their boots and paws. But urgency pushed them onward, both man and dog knowing time was bleeding away. At the crest, Ethan dropped low, pulling Ranger with him. Below, a wagon lay overturned by a twisted pine. Horses kicked and screamed against their harnesses. Beside them a man writhed, clutching his shoulder, blood darkening his shirt. A woman sprawled nearby, bonnet torn, one arm at an unnatural angle. A boy knelt beside her, no older than 10, sandy hair plastered to his tear-streaked face. His cries carried above the chaos. 3 figures loomed near the wreck. One already down, groaning. Another fumbling with a rifle. A third, jaw scarred and eyes cold, raised his weapon. Ethan's mind snapped into the old rhythm. The man on the ground needed pressure on the wound. The woman needed air. The boy needed protection. He whispered low. "Stay close, Ranger." The shepherd's eyes flicked to him, then back to the scene, his body trembling with tension. They descended fast. Loose rock clattered under Ethan's boots, drawing the gunman's attention. The man spun, rifle lifted. "Drop it." Ethan's voice boomed, sharp, commanding, years of authority forged in war. The gunman faltered, but not enough. Ranger surged forward, planting himself between Ethan and danger. His growl vibrated the earth, a wall of scarred muscle standing guard. Ethan slid to the wounded man's side. He was broad-shouldered, mid-30s, his beard matted with blood. His face had already turned pale. "Name?" Ethan barked, tearing cloth from his sleeve, pressing hard against the wound. "Franklin," the man gasped. "Franklin Moore." "Stay with me, Franklin." Ethan tightened the bandage. "Stay awake." The woman stirred faintly, lashes fluttering. Auburn hair spilled from beneath her bonnet. Her features were delicate, hardened only by prairie life. She moaned but didn't wake. Ethan turned to the boy. "You with me, son?" The child nodded through sobs. His name was Daniel, small and thin, but fire still sparked in his wet eyes. The attackers regrouped. One cursed, raising his rifle again. Ethan's stomach clenched, he couldn't protect the family and fight too. His hand went to the knife on his belt. But Ranger was faster. The shepherd erupted forward, a blur of black and scarred fur. He slammed into the gunman, knocking him flat into the mud. The rifle skidded across the ground. The man froze beneath the snarling jaws above him, too terrified to move. Another attacker staggered up from behind the wagon, blood dripping down his temple. His revolver raised, not at Ethan, not at Franklin, but at the boy. Ethan shouted, diving forward. But Ranger was already there. With a roar that shook the hollow, he launched. The revolver fired harmless into the sky as Ranger's jaws clamped down on the man's wrist. He shook violently until the weapon dropped, then pinned the man to the dirt, teeth bared, but stopping just short of the kill. Daniel's breath caught. His wide eyes locked on the dog that everyone had called a monster. "He's a hero," the boy whispered, hoarse with shock. The fight ended as suddenly as it began. The attackers fled into the trees, dragging their wounded, curses echoing as they vanished. Ethan worked quickly. He bound Franklin's shoulder tighter, checked Clara's breathing, and guided Daniel's hands to hold pressure where needed. His voice was steady, decisive, once again the Marine in command. "You'll be all right," he told Franklin, though he knew the wound would need stitching in town. "We'll get you to Billings." Ranger circled once, chest heaving, muzzle flecked with dirt. Then he returned to Daniel's side. The boy reached out, hand trembling, and pressed against the dog's scarred fur. Ranger did not move away. His great head dipped low, amber eyes softening. For the first time, Daniel managed a weak smile through tears. Later, when Ethan loaded the Moore family into his wagon, the whispers began to change. Already Daniel clung to Ranger's thick neck, repeating the same words again and again. "He's a hero. He saved us." Ethan, hearing it, allowed himself the faintest smile. For the first time since the cage, Ranger had proven himself, not just to Ethan, but to the world. And by week's end, all of Billings had heard. At the saloon, men argued whether it was truth or drunken exaggeration. At church, women whispered, torn between awe and fear. Some called Ranger a miracle. Others still muttered, beast. But something had shifted. The monster of Crazy Peak had stood like a shield between a child and a gun. And the story burned across Montana like fire. 3 days after the rescue, a black automobile rolled down the dusty road into Billings. Sleek and polished, its motor purred with authority. It did not belong on the cracked ranch tracks of Montana. From it stepped a man in a dark suit and fedora, shoes so clean they looked foreign against the dirt. His name was Agent Victor Harlan, a federal investigator out of Chicago. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his hair slicked back, his eyes cold slate gray that never wavered. Harlan had built his reputation chasing down cruelty organized into profit, illegal pits, gambling rings, syndicates that turned blood into money. His methods were sharp, often criticized for caring more about results than compassion. He approached Ethan's fence with hands in his coat pockets. His gaze fell on Ranger, lying still in the yard. That animal, Harlan said flatly, nodding, is property of the United States. Evidence in an active case against Marcus Vance's dogfighting syndicate. You'll turn him over. Ethan, sleeves rolled from ranch work, stepped forward. His voice stayed even. He's not evidence. He's family. Ranger rose, sensing tension, moving to Ethan's side. His body tensed, ears angled forward, but he didn't lunge. He simply stood guard. Harlan's eyes narrowed. I know what I'm looking at. That dog was trained to kill. You think you've tamed him. All you've done is delay the inevitable. My orders are clear. He comes with me. Word of the confrontation spread before sundown. The whole town buzzed. At the diner, men muttered that the beast had no place among people. At the church, Ruth Holloway gripped her Bible tight, declaring it unholy to harbor such a creature. Yet others remembered Franklin Moore carried back from the ridge alive only because Ranger had stood between him and bullets. Clara Moore, pale but healing, spoke softly to anyone who'd listen. That dog saved my husband's life. The debate split sharper with every hour. At the feed store, Hank Doyle spat tobacco juice. Monster's a monster. Don't matter if it snarls or smiles. But young Daniel Moore balled his fists, his voice cracking with defiance. He's not a monster. He's a hero. Ethan stood in the middle of the storm, silent, refusing to bend. 2 days later Harlan returned, this time with papers stamped in federal ink. A summons. Ranger's fate would be decided in court. The courthouse in Billings was a squat brick building, more used to settling fence disputes than matters of life and death. But on the morning of the hearing, townsfolk crowded its steps. Some came out of curiosity. Some out of fear. And some, like Clara, Franklin, and young Daniel, out of loyalty. Inside, Judge Walter Whitcomb presided. A stout man in his 50s, with thinning hair and a mustache too heavy for his face, Whitcomb was known for pragmatism over mercy. His gavel came down. The case began. Harlan spoke first. His tone was clipped, his evidence precise. Photographs of pits where dogs had torn each other apart. Ledgers naming a shepherd called Iron Jaw. Testimonies of cruelty organized by Marcus Vance. This animal, Harlan said, pointing toward Ranger, who sat calm at Ethan's side, is that dog. He is living evidence. Without him, we cannot convict the men profiting from this cruelty. The law requires he be surrendered. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Some nodded, convinced. Others shifted uneasily. When Ethan rose, he carried no ledgers or photographs. Only Ranger, walking calmly beside him, leash slack in his hand. You call him evidence, Ethan said, voice low but carrying. I call him a survivor. Look at him. Look at the scars cut into his hide, the way he flinches at a raised hand. He wasn't born a monster. Men made him one, men who thought pain was profit. And he's not here to pay for their crimes. He's here because he deserves a life beyond them. He paused, voice softening. He saved mine. He saved the Moors. That boy, Ethan gestured to Daniel in the front row, is alive because this dog stood between him and a gun. You want proof? There it is. Clara Moore rose slowly, her voice quiet but steady. My husband is alive because of that dog. If you take him, you're not serving justice. You're punishing a victim. Franklin, pale but resolute, nodded from his bench, his arms still bound. Daniel rose on tiptoe, his small voice breaking the silence. Please, Judge. He's my hero. The room went still. Even Harlan's jaw tightened, his gaze flickering for the first time. Judge Whitcomb leaned back, fingers steepled, weighing the room. Finally, he spoke. The law exists to protect the innocent. That includes creatures who have been wronged. I will not condemn this dog to chains again. His gavel struck, sharp as a heartbeat. The shepherd called Ranger is hereby freed. Custody remains with Mr. Ethan Granger. The courtroom erupted, applause, curses, disbelief all tangled together. Ranger sat steady, unbothered, amber eyes calm as if he understood nothing of law but everything of freedom. Ethan knelt, hand pressed to the dog's scarred neck. His voice cracked into a whisper. You're free. Free at last. The ruling had barely settled when the consequences began to stir. Ethan returned to his quiet routine, mending fences, tending his barren fields, Ranger never far from his side. But eyes followed him everywhere. In the general store, whispers cut short when he walked in. At the saloon, men turned away, muttering into their cups. The law had set Ranger free, but freedom was not the same as peace. One evening, Franklin Moore rode out to the ranch. His arm was still bound tight, but his spirit had returned. He sat tall in the saddle, beard fuller now, though his skin still pale. They're talking, Franklin warned, leaning against the horn. The men who lost money on Vance's dogs, they won't take it quiet. You humiliated them in that courtroom. They'll want it back. Ethan listened, jaw set, eyes scanning the horizon. Let them come, he said. Franklin shook his head. This isn't about fair fight, Ethan. They don't want justice. They want blood. That night, under a sky heavy with stars, Ethan lay awake staring at the rafters. Outside, he heard Ranger shifting, restless, growling low at the silence. Ethan rose and stepped into the yard. The shepherd stood alert, nose lifted, amber eyes catching the moonlight. Ethan placed a steady hand on his scarred head. We'll face it together, he whispered. Ranger pressed close, silent, steady. The attack came a week later. It began not with gunfire, but with fire. Ethan woke to the smell of smoke, the frantic cries of horses. He bolted upright, pulled on boots, and raced outside. Flames devoured the wooden stable, sparks leaping into the night sky. The horses inside screamed, thrashing against their stalls. Without hesitation, Ethan tied a wet rag across his mouth and charged in. Heat seared, smoke clawed his lungs. Ranger barreled in beside him, a shadow through fire, snapping ropes and driving the terrified animals toward the open door. Man and dog fought side by side, Ethan cutting halters, Ranger shouldering panicked hooves, until the last horse stumbled free into the night. When they staggered out, blackened by smoke, Ethan saw them. Figures moving across the fields, torches burning, rifles glinting. 5 men. Rough-faced, cruel. At their head was Roy Cutter, once Marcus Vance's right hand in the fighting pits. Tall, narrow-shouldered, his skin leathery from years of violence, his eyes like cold nails hammered deep. Rumor said his thighs bore scars from dog bites, reminders of the beasts he forced into blood. Now he grinned, yellow teeth sharp in firelight. Thought you could steal from us, Marine. That dog belongs in the pit, not at your side. Ethan stepped forward, ash streaking his face. His voice was flat, unshaken. You'll never touch him again. Ranger stood beside him, fur singed, eyes blazing. From behind, a cry split the night. Miriam, barefoot in her nightdress, had run from her family's farmhouse. She threw her arms around Ranger's neck, burying her face against his scars. Don't hurt him, she screamed, her voice breaking with fear. The men laughed harshly. Look at that. The monster's got himself a fan. But more shapes came running from the dark. Miriam's parents, Samuel with his limp but a pitchfork clutched firm, Clara pale but resolute. Behind them, neighbors gathered, drawn by firelight, men with tools in hand, women clutching lanterns, children peering wide-eyed. They hovered at the edge of the field, torn between dread and faith. And in that moment, they saw Ranger not as a beast in chains, but as a shield. A guardian standing between cruelty and innocence. Cutter spat, rifle raised. Step aside, Granger. Ethan planted his feet. His voice carried across the field. If you want him, you'll go through me. The standoff shattered. One of the men fired. The shot cracked the night. Ethan dove behind a hay wagon, revolver drawn. Neighbors scattered, some screaming, others grabbing tools as weapons. Ranger launched forward, a thunderbolt of fury. He slammed into the gunman, ripping the rifle free. Another swung a club, striking his shoulder. Ranger staggered, snarled, then lunged again, forcing the man back with a roar that rattled bones. Ethan fired once, dirt spraying at Cutter's boots. Get out, he shouted. Cutter snarled, lifting his rifle. But before he could fire, Ranger hit him full force. They crashed into the dirt, the rifle skidding away. Cutter kicked hard, drew a knife, and slashed across Ranger's shoulder. The shepherd yelped, blood dark against his fur, but he didn't retreat. With a surge of raw power, Ranger pinned him, jaws bared inches from his throat. Cutter froze, breath ragged, eyes wide with something close to fear. The others faltered. One dragged the wounded. Another dropped his weapon. Their bravado cracked seeing their leader helpless beneath the beast. Fall back, someone shouted. Within moments, they fled into the dark, torches flickering out. Cutter, cursing, was hauled away, leaving smoke and silence behind. Ranger staggered back, blood dripping. Ethan caught him, pressing his hand to the wound. Easy, boy. You're all right. The shepherd leaned into him, breath ragged, but eyes still burning with defiance. Neighbors stepped closer, lanterns trembling in their hands. Clara clutched Daniel to her chest, whispering through tears. He saved us all. Samuel raised his lantern, voice steady for the first time. That's no monster. That's a guardian. Miriam still clung to Ranger's neck, her cheek streaked with soot and tears. He's my hero, she declared. And for the first time, no one argued. Winter in Montana came early, sharp as glass. Snow clung to gullies, and nights cut deep. Yet inside Ethan Granger's weathered cabin, warmth lingered, fragile, but real. Ranger lay stretched before the hearth, his massive chest rising slow, his wound wrapped with linen that seeped less each day. He no longer winced at every step, though sudden cracks from the fire still made him flinch, ears pressed back as though remembering whips long gone. Ethan tended him with patience. Years in the Marines had taught him the slow discipline of healing, and he carried it here, washing the wound with boiled water, changing bandages, murmuring steady words. Sometimes, when exhaustion weighed too heavy, he simply sat with a rough hand resting on scarred fur, finding comfort in the quiet companionship. The barn was gone, black timbers jutting against the sky like broken ribs. Yet from ruin, life began again. Neighbors, once doubtful, now came with offerings. Samuel Moore hammered posts into the earth despite his limp, each strike firm. Clara brought bread and blankets, her presence softening the smoke-tainted air. Even Hank Doyle, who once spat that Ranger was a curse, arrived with lumber. "Wood won't cut itself," he muttered, never meeting Ranger's eyes but no longer calling him beast. And then there was Miriam. The little girl, hair always loose from its braids, cheeks smudged with dust, became Ranger's shadow. Each afternoon she arrived with scraps tucked into her apron. She sat cross-legged by his side, reading from her thin primer, humming lullabies half-remembered. Ranger, who once recoiled from every hand, now let her braid straw into his fur or drape a shawl across his back as if he were a king. His amber eyes softened each time she pressed her small palm against his scarred muzzle. Ethan watched with awe. The war inside him, the ghosts of men buried, the weight of survival, grew quieter when Miriam's laughter filled the yard. He realized one evening, as Ranger nudged the girl for hidden crumbs, that the ranch was no longer only his. It was becoming something more. The idea came while mending fence line. Ethan carved a plank of wood, steady hands cutting deep letters. He nailed it above the gate. "Haven of second chances." The words caught the pale Montana sun. Not just a promise for Ranger, but for any creature cast aside, scarred, or broken. And soon others came. Ruthie Kendall, a tall widow with kind gray eyes shadowed by grief, led in a lame mule. "He can't plow no more," she said softly. "But he deserves grass, not a bullet." Ethan opened the pasture. Then Tom Willis, freckled and gangly, brought a kitten with a torn ear. His cheeks flushed red as he stammered, "Ma said, you'd know what to do." Ranger sniffed the trembling bundle, then lay down, letting the kitten bat at his whiskers. Word spread. The unwanted, the scarred, the abandoned found home on Ethan's land. Neighbors still whispered, still wondered how long it could last, but fear no longer held the same grip. Some lingered at the fence just to watch Ranger patrol, calm, steady, no longer lowering his head but daring the world to see him for what he was. One evening the sky burned gold, snowdrifts glowing under the sunset. Ethan sat on the porch steps, shoulders aching from work but heart lighter than it had been in years. Ranger lowered his head onto Ethan's boot, eyes half closed in trust. Miriam skipped up the path with a basket of small apples. She dropped onto the porch, legs swinging. "He looks happy," she said, nodding at the dog. Ethan ruffled Ranger's fur, voice low. "He is." Then softer, for the shepherd's ears alone. "You're not a monster in a cage anymore. You're family." Twilight deepened, stars pricking one by one. Around them lay wreckage, the burned barn, the scars both flesh and soul. But before them stretched something sturdier than ruin. Belonging. Ethan leaned back. Ranger pressed close, and for the first time in years, Ethan believed life might hold more than survival. It might hold peace. Sometimes the greatest miracles are not thunderbolts from heaven, but a scarred dog learning trust again. A soldier finding rest where there was once only war. A community learning that love can mend what fear once broke. Just as Ranger was no longer a monster in chains, so too are we never beyond God's mercy. In our own lives, we may feel abandoned, scarred, or forgotten. Yet God can shape our pain into testimony, our wounds into hope. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Leave "Amen" in the comments if you believe no life is too broken for God to restore. Subscribe so we can keep sharing stories of faith, second chances, and the quiet miracles God still works through ordinary hands. May the Lord bless you and keep you. And may His grace rest upon you and those you love.